So, dear colleagues, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Shannon Jackson from the University of Berkeley to give the annual lecture of the Käthe Hamburger Research Center Global Disconnect. And the title of her lecture you see behind me. Now, for those of you who are new to the Global Disconnect Center, perhaps just a few words about what we do at the center. It is a fellow program within the network of the Käthe Hamburger Research Centers, which are located at different universities in Germany. Our topic is globalization, but from a what we call disconnective perspective, which means we are interested in the absences, the detours, the delays which characterize globalization just as much as ever-accelerating connectivity. The center unites three key disciplines: history, art history, and theater and performance studies, represented by the three directors, Roland Wenzelhumer, Burcu Dogramaci, and myself. And we also host artistic fellows at the center, and this special conjunction of artistic practice, art, history, and performance studies leads us almost ineluctably to our guest speaker tonight, Shannon Jackson, who I think embodies all these perspectives plus a good dose of globality. Shannon Jackson is the Cyrus and Michelle Hadidi Professor of Rhetoric and Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies at UC Berkeley, where she is currently chairperson of the Department of Art History. Previous to these positions, she's been co-founder and director of the Berkeley Arts Research Center, and she was also associate vice chancellor for the Arts and Design program. Shannon Jackson has had a stellar academic career that has moved across the leading universities of the US, from a BA at Stanford to a PhD in performance studies at Northwestern, and then on to a position as assistant professor at Harvard before she came to land, finally, we could say, at UC Berkeley, where she has been active in the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies. Her major publications, and I should add here, I often introduce speakers, but in this case, it's almost an exception that the titles I will mention, I've actually read. And this is because Shannon Jackson's work is absolutely central to our field of theater and performance studies. And it's pretty hard to work in the field and not engage with Shannon's writing. So I'll just mention a few of them, not the whole CV. That would be too extensive and would take away from her valuable speaking time. So just to sort of set in a few sort of marker publications. I think we first became aware of Shannon's with the publication of her dissertation under the title Lines of Activity, where she examined the Chicago-based Hull House movement, which became very well known in the progressive era of the United States, associated with the work of Jane Addams. But in this case, she applied actually performance studies, a performance studies perspective to this movement. So she applied performance studies to analyze a social movement, which was probably one of the earliest attempts, I think, to extend performance studies into social history beyond what was then a kind of a dichotomy between ethnography on the one hand and performance art on the other. And I think this book also demonstrated her commitment to link performance studies to social and political questions. In her second book, Professing Performance, 2004, this undertakes a genealogy of theater and performance studies in the US Academy, going back to the beginnings of the field and the work of George Pierce Baker and Brandon Matthews and others. And her focus here is, it's a very historical study, but it's ultimately on very current debates and divisions within our field, and she engages with these, I think, with a fascinating amount of historical material. And as with all her work, Jackson's treatment of historical material is finely attuned to the concerns of the present, which makes this book, I think, all the more compelling to read. Now, I think for scholars and students on this side of the Atlantic, I think her monograph, Social Works, Performing Arts, Supporting Publics, 2011, is probably the one that is best known, I think, and has gained the widest international attention. Whereas the first two books had a clear US focus, Social Works deals with an international trend towards relational aesthetics and includes in its purview examples from the US and Europe. And its intellectual agenda places the so-called social turn in contemporary art within the framework of performance studies. Now, there's a lot more I could say about this book, and I think it's had a major impact on our field, and in fact, it's one of the works we'll be referring to in the course of the coming week, dealing with the question of cultural infrastructure. Now, for those of you with limited time budgets, I would direct your attention to her most recent collection, Backstages, Essays Across Art, Performance, and the Social, which was published in 2022. And these 19 essays cover almost the whole range of her academic career. And so read together, they kind of demonstrate the range of her scholarship, which covers performance historiography, theatre theory, gender theory, and a consistent sort of interest in the crossovers between theatre, performance, and the visual arts. And it is the latter, I think, that characterises Shannon Jackson's primary research interests over the past decade, this involvement with the visual arts, installation arts, and a lot of her work in the previous years has been working around those questions. So a final reference, and especially for those of you contributing to our collection at the Centre on Keywords in Globalization Studies. We're trying to edit a collection of keywords in globalization studies. So I would direct your attention to the online publication edited by Shannon and Paula Marincola entitled In Terms of Performance and subtitled A Keywords Anthology Designed to Provoke Discovery Across Artistic Disciplines. It's really cool, and have a look at it. And with that, I will stop and ask Shannon to take the floor, and I would ask you to welcome Shannon Jackson, please.
Thank you, everyone, thank you for the invitation, Chris, and collaborators, whether they be the fellow co-directors, all of the postdocs who've put together such an incredible program, and reader Merit Hack, especially for doing all of the work of logistically getting me here from the United States. I realize, speaking of the United States, that the political dramas of my country are very much front of mind. We found out last night what was happening most recently, just as we were arriving on the train to Munich. I wish I could say that my lecture will speak directly to the situation at hand that involves Joe Biden's withdrawal from the presidential election, but alas, it won't. However, I do think it's worth mentioning before I begin that whatever the limitations of Joe Biden as a president or as a communicator about his presidency, that presidency did happen to pass an incredibly, for the United States, ambitious, expensive, cross-sector investment in physical and social systems, known throughout the country as the infrastructure bill. There were then, here, limits, compromises, and unmet promises in that bill. But in so doing, it does seem to me that he sounded, and his administration sounded, the central theme of our conference, the summer school, and the disconnect platform, bringing the necessity of infrastructural support into intermittent visibility and also imperfect implementation. I will, however, be focusing on some projects that have perhaps less visibility, but for me are terribly important around the arts, around the social, and around the ecological. Perhaps less visibility, but again, important. We'll start with one. The scene is a warehouse of some sort. a packing plant, a distribution center. Looking a bit more closely, the goods being packaged are perishable, perhaps mostly fruits and vegetables. Horizontal rows of open boxes await the contents. Nearby vertical columns of boxes seem all ready to be filled. Meanwhile, people are there to do the filling, dressed in colors that subtly pop with the palette of the space. The reds, greens, and yellows of the food, along with the reds, greens, and yellows of the structures that hold them. The scene was indeed a warehouse, a packing plant, a distribution center, but it is also an art project, one conceived by the multidisciplinary Los Angeles-based artist Lauren Halsey under the title Summa Everything. It was a variant of the dreams and practices that Halsey has been imagining for some time, hoping to join her sculptural practice with a service practice that addressed the needs of neighbors in South Central Los Angeles. She had already secured a rental in the large space adjacent to her studio before the COVID-19 virus hit. But when it hit in 2020, she began to see the deleterious effects of the pandemic on the under-resourced neighborhoods of Black and brown people. It had already been challenging for these residents to access fresh food economically, geographically, logistically. The so-called food deserts across cities and regions of the United States bespeak the inequalities of the food industry's supply chain. Halsey wanted to redirect that chain. Or to use the language of this conference's call, she sought to create a disturbance, a disruption in an infrastructural flow. And there I'm invoking the call that was put out to launch this summer school. And I was going to show you that call to make sure everybody has that language swimming around. But since Christopher so helpfully invoked this language around absences and disturbances within apparent flow, unencumbered flow, is one of those issues here, as well as issues around temporality and promises, the promise and the belated promises sometimes of infrastructure. So have those in mind as you go. Halsey reached out to friends, building connections or disconnections to chefs, grocers, restaurant managers, and eventually farmers, asking for access to fruit and vegetables in bulk, plotting with volunteers about how to redirect their arrival to her studio/warehouse, organizing them, packaging them into CMS boxes, and then transporting them once more to new sites in the Crenshaw neighborhood and others of South Central LA, where neighbors could more easily pick up a box. Summa Everything thus became an example of how to build a DIY food oasis in a so-called food desert. It was and is a mutual aid project to undo food insecurity. It was and is a relational public art project that uses food as a principle of connection. It was and is a social practice that foregrounds and redefines the politics of the supply chain. So I'm interested in Halsey now as a post-pandemic, socially engaged artist with infrastructural aspirations, and also one that might come round to help me elaborate the idea of an ecological infrastructure, but more on that later. For now, I think it's worth reinforcing that Halsey's work chimes with many of the notes sounded in our conference's call and our school's call, or your school's call, especially around the creation and deployment of cultural infrastructure on behalf of social goods, on the unequal disparities of infrastructural systems, and on what it means to disturb those systems within alternative apparatus. And as we'll see later, she also helps me think about a turn to temporality, also in your call for papers, and hence to what the Disconnect platform calls promises, or what I'll call the broken promises of racialized infrastructure, or what Denise Ferreira da Silva might call modernity's unpayable debts. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me back up and reset the scene and offer a preview of the rest of the talk. So we're here in that first thing where I'm giving you a preview. I'll first return to Halsey's work to elaborate it and situate it. And as the US scholar here at a transnational conference that will engage work in Germany, in Ireland, Hungary, and so many more countries around the world, I'll offer today a focus on US and African American diasporic frames as my contribution. From there, I'll also look to Halsey's project to recall shared thinking in infrastructural studies, focusing on Brian Larkin's elaborations on the poetics of infrastructure. How do we know when infrastructural engagement is being poetic, and what might its variance be? And then, in the final sections of the talk, I'll turn to the ecological, one that reckons with more than human frames, while simultaneously engaging with the colonial and racial legacies of inequity and injustice in the history of human-to-human contact. My overriding hope is to suggest that those of us who wish to track the systems of what we in the United States call systemic racism, or what we call the structures of structural inequity, that we need the models and perspectives of infrastructural studies to do so. But it also might work in reverse, that infrastructural studies benefits from the decolonializing ecological frames of racialized environmental justice to track the injustices, the absences, the disturbances, the broken promises of infrastructure, but also its alternatives, its counter-infrastructures, and the possible disconnections of systemic disturbance. So, more on Halsey's practice. While many scholars, curators, and artists have various frames for grappling with publicly engaged art, as Chris mentioned, I have a long-term interest. Only one thought. I've really only had one thought my entire career about how art engages with social infrastructures. Indeed, in a book that Chris referenced, Social Works, published way back in 2011, I started to use words like infrastructure, or infrastructural aesthetics, or infrastructural avowal before I really knew what I was doing. I can't pretend that I do now, but subsequently I tried to understand more and more what the implications might be in subsequent projects. This is a co-edited platform, Public Servants or Backstages, Chris referenced that as well, and also in a number of collaborative platforms where I've learned and continue to learn so much more, as I do this week. I think that these various pursuits seem most relevant to the Disconnect platform, vacillating as I believe this platform does amongst what I'll say is the infrastructure of art making next to the infrastructure in art making. Very briefly, I think of the former as the back end of culture, the support systems of art that might be called cultural infrastructure. And I think of the latter as something like infrastructural aesthetics. That is how artists and artist groups turn the back end of culture and society into aesthetic material in order to engage with and often critique social infrastructure. So whether you see it from a Brechtian perspective in theater, making the apparatus visible, or you see it from an institutional critique genealogy in art history, it's that genealogy I'm thinking of when I think about infrastructures in art making. With that vacillation in mind, I'm also excited to reckon with new frames, new interlocutors, and with a more contemporary global racial, technological, and ecological politics now exemplified in the work of many of those compiled in our reading list, including Bernd Wagner, Dirk van Laak, Marian Burkhardt, Shannon Mattern, Murray Bookchin, and published also by many of the people who are assembled here, including Eve Olney's Ecological Practice, Ursula Strobel's Infrastructural Approach to Art History, Shane Boyle's almost published new book on the art of logistics, and so many more. Entitling this talk, Delivery Systems, Ecological Infrastructures Across the Art, I am thinking a bit more specifically about the logistics of delivery, a la Halsey, as well as the environmental justice implications of those deliveries. I should say that this is part of a larger project right now that I'm working on that seeks to build a kind of cross-arts frame for addressing climate change, one that might incorporate literature, visual art, performing arts, film and video, and the expanded aesthetic field. But for today, I'm both narrower in some ways and wider in other ways, focusing more on the infrastructural that propels the arts, as well as on some artwork that builds eco-infrastructural engagement and future imagining into the themes and materials of the artwork itself. So with that in mind, let's return to Halsey's practice and to the Afro-futures it models and propels. Equipped with her warehouse and seeing the food security needs of nearby communities, Halsey's next inspiration began when she found an abandoned supply of boxes, underused assemblies of cardboards awaiting identity and distribution. Quote, "These boxes," recalls Halsey, "I thought we could use them as vessels of communication." The box itself communicated and provided the means of communication, and soon Halsey and her volunteers had filled 1,200 of them, not only with fruits and vegetables, but also with pamphlets, posters describing nearby legal aid, health services, and job placement services. The function of the box, the thing that contains and a thing delivered, was simultaneously reimagined by this extra gesture of communication, functionality joined with expressivity. What it meant to deliver and to send and deliver was reimagined as well. Rather than following the inequitable and insecure patterns of food delivery, Halsey and her team denaturalized and redirected them at all. Recalled Halsey, quote, "I thought how tight it would be if I could subvert the food supply chain and go straight to the best farmers market in the country, reach out to all of the local county's farmers, and bring in the most beautiful, gorgeous, nutrient-dense product at no cost to folks in the neighborhood," unquote. Food security is, of course, a supply chain issue, and this project intervened in those changed. Spanning out, we could place her work within the context of, say, other US-based African-American social practice projects. For instance, consider Rick Lowe's Project Row Houses, which turned abandoned shotgun houses in Houston into a compound of artistic residencies and exhibition that doubled and tripled as after-school programs, elder care programs, and as a resource for survivors of domestic violence. Or it might recall the Dorchester Project, initiated by Theaster Gates in Chicago, which also bought and renovated structures in Southside Chicago to create food spaces, listening spaces, a DIY library, and other spaces of assembly. Like those projects and artists, Halsey uses that mixture to create alternate social functions in relation to such systemically engaged, in order to perhaps imagine a kind of rehearsal or testing ground for an alternative social model. Halsey frames her work in relation to artists like that and artists like Rick Lowe and Theaster Gates. She also simultaneously redeploys the resources of the art world and the sales of her art, again, mobilizing different resources for different kinds of good. She appeared on the cover of Artforum, a transnationally renowned art journal. And since this project began, she had spoken often about the engagement of her work with the political and speculative frames of Afrofuturism, a kind of Afrofuturism that, of course, became rekindled even further and more brightly during the pandemic with the Black Lives Matter movement. Halsey speaks often of this desire around Afrofuturist utopias, and it motivated her earlier, before the pandemic, to install the Crenshaw District Hieroglyph Project inside the Hammer Museum in LA as a kind of monument to the neighborhood that simultaneously imagined cross-temporal connection back to ancient Egypt. Since then, she has done much more. Within the art world, she transformed the David Kordansky Art Gallery into a sculptural city where the P-Funk colors of Los Angeles popped even more. She installed, and here's different ways that her structures create a different kind of environment, but also enable a certain kind of resource when it comes to the, I'll call it the for-profit engagement with the art world as well. So in that mix, she's done much more. She's also installed columns of those Afro-themed hieroglyphs at MoMA in New York last year. And if you've been to the Venice Biennale, you also know that she installed her columns outside of the Arsenale at this year's Venice Biennial. Adjacent and outside of the art world, she's also since broken ground on the Summa Everything Community Center and Outdoor Sculpture Park, which joins her columns and colors with the multi-sector aspirations of public service, redistributing food, but also planning after-school programs, wellness programs, and more for the neighborhood. In all of this work, which joins, you could say, something of everything, she elaborates on the speculative principles of Afrofuturist utopia building, where the everything means holding many forms and processes simultaneously, many times and spaces simultaneously as well. And I'll offer just one longish exemplary quote. That's the cool thing about Afrofuturism and P-Funk, she says. You're everywhere at once. I'm in 1927, but I'm also in 2020, and I'm also in tomorrow. Even though this project is to scale architecture, it's still a model. This is where the hieroglyph, Egypt thing comes in. I'm obviously inspired by the neighborhood in South Central and my family and friends, but on a very personal and deep level, I'm inspired by Black alternative theological groups that have the same weird, idiosyncratic exceptions that I have around myth-making in ancient Egypt. That drives me. That gives me the energy to build the Crenshaw District Hieroglyph Project. And then within the culture of Egypt, remixing and all that, beautiful pyramid builders and designers who also didn't have degrees in architecture, but who were at the time building and proposing actual architectures in which Black people can experience themselves differently, unquote. So I'd like us to keep this in mind, this kind of frame in mind, this idiosyncratic, Afrofuturist frame, one that inhabits the past, the present, and tomorrow, while proposing new architectures, new patterns, new gestures, new lines of assembly. That remixing is never easy, of course. In her earliest food-based experiments, she noted, my biggest challenge was refrigeration. Once we got the hang of how to operate and drive the refrigerator truck, we were able to figure out the hack of getting this very beautiful, super nutrient-dense food from farm to truck to South Central, unquote. What Halsey calls the hang and the hack was also a logistical art, a strategic disturbance within the supply chain. This is to say that logistics was both the object of attention and the method of implementation, a la Shane Boyle, both the theme and the form, the critical problem, and the method of redressing it. The back-end politics of infrastructural delivery thus became the material of an infrastructural aesthetic. Eventually, the boxes, these vehicles of communication, made it to new sites, as I showed you earlier, in Crenshaw, at Nickerson Gardens, at the Black Worker Center of Los Angeles, and more. All right. So having gone in there for a while, let me zoom out a bit more and try to stitch some relations to some of the themes of the conference and school. For now, I thought I might take up some connections around disconnects, infrastructural thinking, and link it to one essay, also now over 10 years old, Brian Larkin's essay on the poetics and politics of infrastructure, which did a helpful literature review of so many others. I'll focus even more on the poetic part. What makes infrastructure poetic in Larkin's frame, and why is that poetic effect important? As you know, if some of you have done your reading or your rereading, Larkin returned to Roman Jakobson's classic early work on semiotics to stage that elaboration. Recall that Jakobson was a literary critic and early progenitor of the field of semiotics, with an ever-widening readership in the social sciences, especially anthropology. Jakobson's thinking on signification linked a literary approach on the sign to the social study of humans as sign-making creatures. What was learned on the page of a textual close reader could be adapted to a wider field of action, ritual, and world-making, where the materiality of the signifier became important, if not more important, than the content of what was signified. So that signified structure is probably at this point so naturalized for us in the humanities that it's hard to even recreate anything like its revelatory power at the time. But let's try to do a quick review, back to basics review, to make sure we're all on the same page. For Larkin and those he cites, The detachment of the material signifier was key to understanding what he called the process of doubling in infrastructural built environments. That is, how systems and practices operate in variance with their purported objective. What distinguishes the poetic, he reminded everyone, is when a speech act is organized according to the material qualities of the signifier itself, rather than to its referential meaning. It is when the palpability of the sign becomes the dominant determining function of a particular speech act. Poetics is thus a rearranging of the hierarchy of what signification within the speech event is dominant at any moment. And just to take the quote a bit longer, in the case of infrastructures, the poetic mode means that form is loosened from technical function. Infrastructures are the means by which a state proffers those representations to its citizens and asks them to take those representations as social facts. It creates a politics of as if. The budget must act as if it were a realist representation, and those issuing and receiving it act as if it were a consequential document. Infrastructures, he said, execute technical functions. They move traffic, water, or electricity by mediating exchange over distance and binding people and things into complex heterogeneous systems, and by operating as and textualize forms that have relative autonomy from their technical function. To conceive of this operation as a form of poetics, in the Jacobsonian sense, is to rearrange this hierarchy of function so that the aesthetic dimension of infrastructure, rather than its technical one, is dominant. You can come back later and read that. That's a long quote, I know, and there's a few more coming. But just a few things to sound here. The poetic is thus a rearranged hierarchy of functions, content, and forms, as well as an invitation to consider how the material form itself can do the work of expression. It must be said that some of these elaborations around infrastructural poetics give it, to my ear, a kind of anti-theatrical ring, or subtly suggesting that this rearrangement can be a kind of brainwashing subterfuge by the state. The budget operates as if it is real, begging the question of what is actually real. But for those of us interested in the arts, and especially artists who seek to expose and redirect infrastructural operations, we might spy in here an aesthetic strategy, one that also rearranges relations amongst material systems and social expression, but for a different kind of as if. Recall Lauren Halsey. These boxes, I thought we could use them as vessels to communicate. Indeed, it seems to me that many socially engaged artists are often creating, quote, intextualized forms with relative autonomy from their technical function, or make strategic use of the as if in order to bring these systems to a kind of visibility and to open them up to a different kind of reordering. Forgive me if this is too basic or we already know this, but it's scene setting for me. To aestheticize the social or to poeticize social infrastructure is thus not necessarily to diminish its authenticity or rob citizens of their agency, but quite the opposite in these projects. The aspiration is to defamiliarize an everyday system in order to make its operation available for critique and for redirected agency, disturbed agency. In Halsey's case, and that of many African American social practice artists, it is to expose the broken promise of some infrastructures in order to imagine new ones. Larkin's essay contains much more that I look forward to discussing later in a Thursday masterclass. But for now, I'll just foreground one more element, a genealogy of thinking that moves almost directly back to other aesthetic histories. Recalling Susan Buck-Morse and others, he cites an older Aristotelian concept of aesthesis. Aesthesis refers not to the mental appreciation of works of art, but to a bodily reaction to lived reality. Quoting Susan Buck-Morse, it is a form of cognition achieved, though, through taste, touch, hearing, seeing, smell. Aesthetics, in this sense, is not a representation, but an embodied experience governed by the ways infrastructures produce the ambient conditions of everyday life. Larkin goes on to connect those ambient conditions to the materiality of infrastructure. The materials of infrastructure, iron, mud, concrete, fiber optic cables, plastic, both stand for an era, in the sense that, for instance, iron was exemplary material of the 19th century, but also bring about a sensory apprehension of existence, unquote. So I'd like to let this kind of thinking hang too. To let this sensory, bodily, material aesthesis linger as I continue to think about infrastructural aesthetics with you all, while the state might employ practices that affect citizens bodily, sensorially, and ambiently. We, of course, know that artists do too, but often to promote, you could say, a counter-cathexis, redirecting bodily energy and sensory energy. When Lauren Halsey, for instance, describes the P-funk and pop of an African-American urban landscape, she's arguably channeling aesthesis for a Black futures movement, reproducing it in her warehouse, in her boxes, and also in the transtemporal Egyptian columns, sculptures, and architectural interventions that fill her galleries, that disturb biennials, and that propel now a material and embodied vision for a different kind of community center. Okay, working ahead. So that was me using Halsey as a vehicle for re-engaging Larkin. From here, I'm going to span out to think about delivery systems a little differently across the arts in our supply chain, but also what might be called the delivery systems of the ecological. Ecological systems include those with carbon footprints and carbon offsets, those that partake of extractive economies, and those that model alternative economies. But they also include the elemental delivery systems of the planet, the winds and clouds that link different domains of the globe. And even more speculatively, or what Halsey might call idiosyncratically, ecological delivery systems also link different histories, crossing temporalities between then and now, here and there, between humans and materials, helping us understand the present tense legacies of colonization and slavery, along with the extractive economies they have been supporting for over 400 years. So let's start first with a fairly familiar, if still intractable frame on what an ecological approach to infrastructure might mean. It means, of course, contending with the carbon footprint and ecological impact in every chain of our supply. Obvious examples lie in the oil and gas expended in the cargo ships that transport our massive shipping containers, or the aircrafts that send goods and people, including yours truly, through the sky to different regions of the world. An ecological approach to infrastructure would thus track and seek to diminish the energy drained by our everyday delivery systems. We can take that frame a step further, of course, to the disconnect platform to implicate the arts. Here we would foreground the dependence of the arts on those same fuel-heavy systems, even if they are delivering luminous artworks and well-intentioned people to venues like the Venice Biennial, where I just was, or to Munich, where I am now. That frame foregrounds the ongoing ecological paradox of all of us, scholars, curators, citizens, artists, who send ourselves and our projects across the world to share our work on climate responsiveness. The content and form of the work might seek to combat ecological devastation, while the infrastructure of delivery systems tend to exacerbate it. But those insidious implications of that paradox become even more complicated when we take in and take on much more expansive understandings of what the ecological means for us across time, across space, and with a multi-species orientation on what it means to inhabit the planet. And because this interlude is jam-packed and condensed with an array of thinking from an array of scholars, all I've done for you is put together a few sample books of the kind of thinking that informs the next couple of paragraphs, which will be speedy. The If, for instance, after Anna Singh, or after Rosie Braidotti, or after Donna Haraway, our task is to engage in a post-human, other than human, or more than human stance on the world, it arguably requires a shift in understanding the nature of infrastructure, indeed the nature in infrastructure. Anna Singh's essay on more than human sociality, for instance, asks what she calls some alarmingly big questions. First, how did anyone ever come up with the idea that non-humans are not social? And further, what about things that are not alive? Aren't they social too? I cannot think of a good reason to argue that non-vital things are not social. And you can see her searching for a word to describe what she's talking about. After all, they are constituted in relations with others, they react, they are transformed. The more than human stance brings more paradoxes and more questions. How does a human artist or human scholar participate in her own decentering? Of course, if a so-called climate crisis is prompting a reevaluation of the human and its relation to the materials of the world, that reevaluation looks even more paradoxical and frankly quite belated from an indigenous and decolonial perspective, especially for the descendants of colonized and enslaved subjects who didn't have ready access to the privileges of the human category in the first place. This means reckoning deeply and variously with the chain that links the histories of extractive economies and the histories of slavery and colonization. This means reckoning with how the violent extraction of people and their movement across the globe coincided with the extraction and unequal capitalization of the world's resources. The contemporary supply chains of the globe thus sit atop those chains of trade and exploitation, undergirding what Rob Nixon calls the environmentalism of the poor. It is precisely the present legacy of past colonial and slave economies that made Sylvia Wynter argue for a new world order post-1492, one that would undo what she called the unlivability of urban redevelopment now. To understand ecological infrastructures, we'll say the ecology of infrastructures, the ecology in infrastructures, means addressing not simply fossil fuels, but the imbrication of those fuels and their delivery systems with histories of violence and injustice, histories that contribute to food deserts and all kinds of deserts now. So let me stop for a second to signpost a dialectical problem that anticipates one that I think might unfold throughout our school this week, invoking the concerns of Murray Bookchin, cited in our Disconnect reader, who worries rightly, I think, that more than human frames spawn, quote, this is him, half-finished thoughts, clouded over by a mystical haze, that such biocentric, indeed cosmocentric, to coin a word, views have been absorbed to one degree or another by eco-mystics, eco-theologians, goddess disciples, eco-primitivists, anti-technologists, and even certain eco-feminists, raising serious questions about where the ecological movement is going. That's the end of the quote. I too worry about certain uses of a more than human frame that can bypass political questions of social justice, prompting a communicating with plants and animals, crystals from the earth, and stars in the cosmos without grappling with the abusive societies and unequal economies of the planet that circulate and propel and undergird exactly those same entities. But when that more than humanness is joined with the thinking of a decolonial project, the critique of the human, I think, has a much different ring. As Catherine Yousaf argues in A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, or as Sylvia Wynter and Denise Ferreira da Silva also have argued, a more than human orientation on the world does not necessarily bypass the history of human-to-human exploitation and injustice. For Wynter, McKittrick, Da Silva, and many more, this means upending Western epistemic binaries, those that make sense, often, of Western lives, or what Wynter calls upending the georacial syntax of post-Enlightenment configurations. That syntax includes binaries between nature and culture, human and animal, mind and body, animate and inanimate, vital and non-vital, sentient and non-sentient, comforting binaries to some that might be colonizing binaries to others. Whether mobilizing the science of physics, biology, or geology, we now reckon with the ecological interdependence of various forms of life, as well as the permeation amongst cells, biomes, fluids, chemicals, and minerals. Of course, the we who must now reckon could have learned long ago from indigenous and decolonial worldviews that would not necessarily have assumed a differentiation amongst living species, and certainly not the hierarchy in the first place, nor would they have assumed a sure separation between epochs of time, between past, present, and tomorrow, between ancestor and descendant, between 1927 and tomorrow. To reckon ecologically, this also means reckoning temporally. And this is a place that I think also aligns with another word and phrases sounded in the Disconnect platform, where ideas about time, infrastructural questions mean dealing not only with space, but issues of time, issues of what might often be called progress, and also with what might be called a promise, the projected promise of infrastructure. For all of these thinkers, however, it means inhabiting not singular, but multiple temporalities. For Denise Ferreira da Silva, actually, she calls it an atemporality, assimilating the coincidence amongst actions taken then and effects endured now, even idiosyncratically experiencing the past and present simultaneously, or what she sometimes says, a present that has multiple beginnings. Says Da Silva somewhat humorously in an interview, "The most sophisticated term I have for it is to mess up assumptions about separability," unquote. So this is one of many places where it seems to me an ecological movement might also reckon with a georacial syntax of post-Enlightenment configuration. Finally, my last section. Having ventured, and I'll admit it, very rapidly through a dense and philosophical and political terrain in the last section, I'm going to return now to two systemically engaged art practices that might help aerate that thinking and give it some ways of concretizing it as well. I'll share some thoughts about two large-scale projects that both use clouds as a political and aesthetic concept and material. The Cloud Studies of Forensic Architecture, and the film Ancestral Clouds, Ancestral Claims, co-directed by Arjuna Newman and Denise Ferreira da Silva. As many of you know, da Silva is not only a groundbreaking scholar, but also a very committed and inventive artist. So I thought it was helpful to see some of her art making next to some of her thinking. So what if we add clouds to our understanding of delivery systems, and by extension, clouds as an ecological infrastructure, one that delivers across space, across time, and with a mix of sentient material? First, a disclaimer. I realize that many might be aware of the political controversies following so much of the work of forensic architecture in light of this Israeli-based firm's positions on Palestine, including the political controversy that shadowed Cloud Studies when its exhibition was closed at the Whitworth in Manchester, and its director, Alistair Hudson, was fired by the University of Manchester. Alistair is now your colleague here in Germany, having moved, you perhaps all know, to become director of ZKM in Karlsruhe. However, my goal here today is to consider the work that was shared, or was meant to be shared, which focused on the United States, largely because this aspect of their project helps give some shape to the racialized political ecology I glossed above. So first of all, Cloud Studies continued forensic architecture's long-term counter-use of architectural tools, not necessarily to build new environments, but to investigate the remains of old ones. In this case, they were tracking the toxic remains populating air particles, those that traveled across regions and epochs in areas such surrounding Lebanon and London, Palestine and Namibia, to consider what they called the connectedness of global atmospheres amidst what Achille Mbembe calls, quote, the universal right to breathe, unquote. A portion almost exhibited in Manchester that has since been exhibited near me at the San Jose Museum of Art focused on the toxins emitted in the industrial factories of Louisiana in the United States and their historic connection to the slave population plantations centuries before. The so-called plantation-to-plant relation thus exemplifies a potent trans-temporal one explored under a title that simultaneously doubled as a kind of provocative prompt. If toxic air is a monument to slavery, how do we take it down? The agricultural practices of cotton farming required the extractive and violent practices of slavery. Eventually, the same plots of land were passed within white wealthy families or sold to different white wealthy families or white-owned firms to fuel an industrial economy. Forensic architecture remodeled what are now the deathly relations of the past in their disconnective forensic use of architectural tools. They visually aligned the plantation house with the factory house, the swirls of smoke of the cotton gin undergirding those of future factories. They tracked the practice of burial and non-burial of dead slaves, those who succumbed, and I just am showing my bad documentation here, which just got turned over for some reason. They visually aligned in order to is it going to happen again? Let me see if it happens again. Oh, it does. Okay. Let's see if it's different with this one. Oh, okay. This is iPhone documentation, and this is its casualty, and showing it here. Hopefully, it gives you a sense of how some of the visuals work, but I'll go back to some of the other. There's something I did that got me out of the slide presentation, Felix? If you can just help me advance. Eventually, thank you so much. We'll go to the next one too. No, the next one, there we go. Okay, we'll stop there. Thank you. They visually aligned the plantation house with a factory house. And I'll back up because the full sentence has to be said. They tracked the practice of burial or non-burial of dead slaves, those who succumbed to southern heat and were buried directly in the ground amidst the crops, largely because plantation owners did not want to sacrifice resource-rich land for cemeteries for workers who were not considered human in the first place. They also used sensors and heat maps to show the flow of toxic air across plots of land and regions of the state, and of course across time, now undergirding chronic sickness and terminal illness of the current population in a region that is now nationally known in the United States as Cancer Alley. As such, this case study in the United States demonstrates Sylvia Wynter's arguments about the historic illnesses and resource extractions of a colonial world order, as well as, you could say, her double use, if you know Sylvia Wynter's work, of the word plot to describe both the unequal ownership of space as well as the unequal colonial histories plotted across time. Arguably, forensic architecture's title and prompt also was an atemporally idiosyncratic frame, wondering if a violent history could somehow be retroactively taken down in order to undo its effects in the present. This piece then demonstrates, edges toward it seems to me, how a more than human orientation on the relation amongst living things and material might also deeply engage with histories of human-to-human violence. The concept of Cancer Alley requires an elemental, microbial understanding of the more than human, reckoning with the permeability of toxins within the air and in the skin of humans who are poisoned by them. That porosity can be a metaphor for, again to quote De Silva, the inseparability between humans and their environment, messing with the perceived boundary between the edge of the human body and the beginning of the world around it. That intimate and local inseparability translates in cloud studies to wider layers of inseparability, those that would have divided most locally and intimately, the division between master and slave, and wider again, those that would divide the urbanity of a Louisiana city from the rurality of the plantation whose resources supported it. Again, that separability works across time as well as space. The plantation to plant history carries the history of the slave trade into the poisonous plants, meaning factories, if you're hearing the English word, of contemporary industrialization, one whose cancers were planted as seeds long ago and whose histories coexist in a continuous present now. Before concluding, I wanted to invoke one more project, another cloud project, Ancestral Clouds, Ancestral Claims, co-directed by Denise De Silva and her collaborator, Arjuna Newman. As I suggested above, this anti-colonial sense of simultaneous time, or again, a temporal coincidence, underwrites De Silva's art-making as much as her thought-making. It also undergirds her elaboration of a minerally charged more than humanness, one that appears in her scholarship and in the film I'll just only have the chance to gesture to now. This film was mostly shot in the Atacama Desert of Chile, a site that is one of the world's largest mines, one reactivated under Pinochet, along with the labor camps associated with it. Also a place that houses currently astronomy labs and astronomy gear for gazing into the sky and into the cosmos. While it's shot mostly there, there's constant implication of the clouds' relationship to winds that carry across the globe, connecting always implicitly, sometimes explicitly, links and lines and delivery systems to the Amazon, to the Sahara, and across the Pacific coast. Ancestral Clouds is part of a series that they call elemental cinema, a film where they're focusing on different elements of the planet, fire, water, rock, and air. This one focuses obviously on the all too potent delivery system of air and clouds, powerful, whether powering the wind of a slave ship or emanating from the spire of a poison-spilling factory, or tacitly holding past and present in bodies, minerals, and germs. Here is Newman and De Silva elaborating on these phrases that they like to use, that I think are provocative: elemental sociality and mineral solidarity. This is De Silva. We have a sensory experience of an indistinction and I think that's a possible idea for solidarity, a sensory solidarity, both within ourselves and beyond people. The other idea is the idea of dead slaves or Marxists or dissidents whose mineral matter gets carried up into the cloud and meets cosmic stardust, plastics, microplastics, bacteria, etc. In the cloud, you have a kind of swirling migratory ecosystem, which invokes another model of solidarity that borrows from more traditional notions, but thinks of it in an expanded planetary or interplanetary way. So this is perhaps also an idiosyncratic way of describing the planet's delivery systems, but it is arguably one, and I'll signpost again, that seeks to join a more than human frame about minerality and mixture with histories of human-to-human violence. It is also one that might even chime with earlier frames in infrastructural poetics, including the aesthetic dimension that Buck-Morse and Larkin cultivated in their notion of the sensory relation to lived reality, or the bodily relation to lived reality. We can spy this connection in a longer quote from which I called that first phrase, that sophisticated term about inseparability. This is her in an interview. The most sophisticated term I have for it is to mess up assumptions about separability, which has been necessary precisely for the kind of knowledge mentioned before. That's the geo-racial syntax, the Western epistemes that divide human and human from animal, body from material, sentient from non-sentient. Film can do that, this messing of separability, because in addition to dressing us in terms of what we know and how we think, images can also make us feel in a certain way. Through this very thinking, feeling moment, sensibility as the traditional concept of capturing the aesthetic can be shifted or messed up. The effort here, then, is to think-feel a different relation, creating a kind of counter-aesthesis through the manipulation of the cinematic medium. The thinking-feeling sought here is one that joins a decolonial justice movement with a more than human ecological thinking. If, to quote Larkin earlier, if you recall Larkin, recalling that the materials of infrastructure, iron, mud, concrete, fiber optic cables, plastic, both stand for an era and also bring about sensory apprehension of existence, then we could say that De Silva seems to be asking how the extractive histories of the elements can be disturbed and redirected toward an elemental solidarity. Or if a politically fraught mineral history also undergirds Brian Larkin's history of materials, how can that same history also become the basis for a different kind of redirected mineral solidarity? I'll let a final quote from De Silva's own thinking help me frame the pursuit of her art making. And I won't read all of this. I know there's been a lot of quotes. The claim should not be understood as an anthropological one, nor as a biological one, nor as a historical one or universal, but as an elemental one. That is a claim that assumes the inseparability of everything, not only human, but also what is non-human and all of that. Everything that has been made possible because of extraction, the original displacement and expropriation. So it is a demand for the restoration of everything, a mandate that carries both utter necessity and absolute impossibility. And perhaps some of you have already started to read the rest of the quote. Again, this remains another kind of speculative, idiosyncratic imagining. But I find myself asking how this notion of the inseparability of everything and everyone could drive a renewed understanding of our planet's infrastructures and delivery systems that connect and disconnect us. And I don't have time to truly show you the film, but perhaps I can have it going as a suggestion in the back. Maybe I'll just play this for now, Felix. I'll go here. I'll just do this much. This is just their trailer. See if I can get it. This is, I feel badly that it's only going to give you a suggestion, and I do have access to a full Vimeo that we could show more of. But while it's going in the background, I'll slip into a conclusion that still remains exploratory and speculative for me. I find myself asking how the separability of everything and everyone can drive a renewed understanding of the planet's infrastructures.
This film begins in a few places, as all ghost stories do.
Can you hear it?
It is all beginnings, since we now know.
And you can hear her in the voiceover also articulating as a narrator this notion of the elemental, but also her ideas about atemporality. So I'll turn the volume off and keep it going. Thank you. Or Felix will. Thank you. So if this notion about the inseparability of everything and everyone could come back to my earlier thoughts. Is it still going? It's okay. Even returning to Lauren Halsey, we can spy a provocative prompt inside her colloquial title, Summa Everything, a speculative term for the restoration of everything. And everything based upon the notion that everything or everything was and is inseparable in the first place. Halsey's rejoining of the everything is both utterly necessary and also an absolute impossibility. For me, the political potency of this more than humanist does not replicate the mystical haze that rightly concerns Bookchin, but it offers us and edges us toward a kind of more than humanist that can actually expose and imagine beyond the existential inequalities of planetary cohabitation. As such, it shows how the idiosyncrasies of Afro-speculation, imagining, coincide with an ecological reimagining of infrastructural relations. De Silva, Halsey, Winter, many other scholars and artists help me think about how that kind of turn to temporality, however weird and idiosyncratic, and to promises, especially to the broken promises of racialized infrastructure or of unpayable debts, animates our current present and also necessarily propels a different kind of imagining. Once again, my overriding hope has been to suggest that those who wish to track the systems of what we in the U.S. call systemic racism, or the structures of what we call structural inequity, need the models and perspectives of infrastructural studies, and a reminder about the reverse. I suggest that infrastructural studies needs the decolonializing ecological frames of racialized environmental justice movements to track the injustices, the disturbances, the absences, the broken promises, and the disconnections of infrastructural re-engagement. Artists are not going to solve everything, and certainly not going to solve it at scale. But they do have a role in sensitizing us to eco-justice issues. If we have a chance of joining a more than human decentering with an avowal of its relation to human violence and its histories, it seems to me that artists are well positioned to feel us to that connection, creating sensory visuals, sounds, environments, screens that allow us to test another bodily relation to lived reality. A counter-aesthesis for a counter-imaginary. If this seems non-rational and idiosyncratic, then perhaps it is no less non-rational than the myth that colonization was progress, that frontier extractivism was manifest destiny, or that post-Enlightenment democracies actually created equitable supply chains for everyone. It wasn't. It isn't. They didn't. Amidst this pile of broken promises, eco-infrastructural art making might offer a counter-logistics, another plot, another assembly, another supply chain poised to deliver a different kind of infrastructural poetics. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Shannon, for this very, very challenging expansion of the notion of infrastructure. It's a wonderful way to start the week, and I'm sure there are many questions. So I invite you to pose your well-considered, perfectly formulated questions. Yes, we've got Ben at the big is going to start off.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating, and your excursion back into the basics of semiotics reminded me of a lot of Baudrillard and the tyranny of the signifier. And I have a lot of warm memories there.
Yeah,
but,
some grad seminars.
but I was wondering, if we divorce the signifier from the signified and focus on the aesthetic dimension, it seems that there's a lot of political ambivalence there, where you can have people say the climate data, measuring what happens with the climate, that's just a bunch of, those statistics are just signifiers, and they're a distraction. We prefer the aesthetics of like burn, baby, burn. Mm-hmm. Or the temporality that separates us from Bronze Age Palestine, and the stories that they were coming up with back then, and the connection of signifier and signified with women in the Bible. It's just a distraction. Let's just play with the signifieds.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could say something about the political ambivalence involved in the infrastructural poetics.
Yeah, thank you. That is the occupational hazard, and I think the ongoing occupational hazard of this issue. And I think that in many ways, even this supposed opposition and the playfulness that we have, the war stories that we have associated with it, I think that they've come to a different kind of, the bluff has been called in many ways in a lot of political contexts now in a sort of post-truth moment where anybody can say what they want, or let's do the burn baby, let's have these sort of phrases and distractions that actually have no referential relation, and that is so much about how empty, egregious politics works. And I remember at one point, I guess in the 90s or something, when a colleague of mine then at Harvard said, wow, George Bush is a postmodernist, which was sort of like, oh gosh, it's all signifier. So absolutely point taken. And I also was trying to sound that at the moment when I talked about Larkin saying that the process of doubling, that the poetic gesture is foregrounding in Achille Mbembe too, is almost a kind of the subterfuge by the state. Look over there at this pretend thing that isn't standing in for something real. So I absolutely take your point, and I guess I found myself not wanting to let go of what the possibility is for deploying the signifier in different ways. What I think is happening in a lot of these practices is that similar signifiers, or the materiality of it, actually start to point and have references to things that they didn't have before in the unequal exchange or in the routinized, normalized relations that they were in. So, we can have access to food anywhere, or we live in a democracy. The exposure and the focus of the materiality of the signifier temporarily allows for that the normalized equation between that signifier and this referent gets loosened. I think not so it stays empty, but so that it starts to attach to other reference. So, that would be a way to take this thought further, actually, is for me to challenge you, and your question challenges me to think more about what are the reference, the less visible reference, the less visible neighborhoods, the less visible inequities that Halsey is exposing in redirecting. And to me, that's where I'd go, but it never is ever going to be foolproof. It's never not going to be, and I think also open to yet another kind of appropriation. I don't think that there's, a silver bullet here, and also, as anybody, those who study, say, the history of the avant-garde or the history of conceptual art know what happened too with a whole lot of artistic movements that basically made those same type of gestures. Let's put everyday life in quotation marks so we can critique it. And some of those moves got played out. So I don't pretend that it's foolproof, but I do actually think that some of these artists working at scale and working with communities who have a different way of reading are still making really interesting alternative use of this classic historic war story-ridden pairing. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. For me, this is a great ending of a year that I spent here at Global Disconnect.
Oh, really? Oh,
as a historian, because what I found so inspiring is really to think between the arts and history, for instance, or other sciences. And I was wondering if I could press you a bit more to think about this transfer, because I thought it was really interesting how you led us towards thinking about disrupt or defamiliarize as the movement we should take in our practice, maybe as historians as well. And this is slightly disruptive for historians, I guess, because they're trained to analyze, to structure, to explain. So we have a different set of verbs that we usually have to describe our practice, which I think can be critiqued. But I'm wondering what happens if, as you just said in your reply, if we have this more artistic take to history, for instance, where the goal might just be to defamiliarize. And I thought infrastructure is really a good way to do it. And I was wondering if you could give a few more examples maybe from your books or your work. I thought actually the boxes as communication were really interesting, as kind of defamiliarizing, but also maybe analyzing, structuring. I mean, it's more a comment, I guess.
Yeah,
that
okay.
we have at
So
the center, I think we have this
Yeah.
disconnect, I mean, I guess, between practices of analyzing, structuring, explaining, very classic sets of approaching science, but then
So
also
you-
the more artistic ones.
So you're coming to this tripartite platform as an historian.
Well, I was here as a historian.
And now who knows what you are?
That's right. So
All right.
But I'm thinking of it as a really also a real question, because I do think that two don't come together as seamlessly as we would like.
No, I agree. And Chris referenced my first book, which was a historical book. It was on a site that is very prominent in U.S. History, especially progressive era history. So it's a site that is kind of, for U.S. historians, everybody teaches it in a sort of trajectory of U.S. history. So, I was working on material where I imagined a lot of finger shaking about what was I going to do with it. So I understand some of the, I've been, I think, living with that challenge for a while, and really appreciate the challenge. I was really influenced at the time, and this may not be what other of your colleagues want to hear, but by meta-historical thinking at the time. I was really interested in how, frankly, the signifier-signified thought structure started to circulate. This is a little fast and loose intellectual history in so many fields. In anthropology, in history, in geography, along with, as they were, burgeoning in the humanities fields, in art history and literary history. And the way that I think, one of the ways that it showed up in the history field is with the notion, you could say, of historiography. Not what is the history, but how do we write the history? So I became really interested in trying to imagine a form of historical writing that, to invoke Brecht, showed its seams, that showed that this argument rested atop this document found in the archive, rather than sort of repressing it in a footnote only, and just like covering over, but to sort of show its construction. And for me, I wanted to see how it is for others, but for me, it didn't automatically dilute the argument to see the conditions of its making. And that, to me, could be a thing you might think about taking with you. That many of these, you could say, meta-art practices of the 20th century have, whether, again, I was very quick, but whether the meta-theater of Brecht that shows its apparatus, there's a whole genealogy of expanded visual art that basically exposes art's dependence upon the museum apparatus, the cultural infrastructures of the museum. And the fact of showing that dependence doesn't have to pull the rug out from under its power, I don't think. And I guess you might fear that it does. Oh my gosh, is this a ruse after all? But what happens if you show its construction, show its seams, and then invite others to stitch with you? That's one thought, and I could say more, but hope that's somewhat helpful.
Shane?
Thank you, Shannon. That was fantastic.
There's a microphone coming to amplify you.
Thank you, Shannon. That was fantastic. A lot to think about. I'm wondering if you could speak to some of the differences between the artworks that you talked about a little bit more. So, for instance, I'm specifically thinking of what seems like a pretty stark difference between, say, the work of forensic architecture, Denise Ferreira da Silva, and then Lauren Halsey, the work that you started with, that one seems to be, I'm going to be vulgar here, very representational, and then the other seems to actually be representational, but also making a direct material intervention into kind of supply chains, that sort of thing. So I'm wondering if you could maybe, what happens if we de-aestheticize Lauren Halsey and think of it in terms of mutual aid rather than some representation of the failures of supply chains?
Yeah. I think this actually even relates to the first question, if we just focus on Lauren Halsey, because the fact is, as much as I might say, this exposes the supply chain to make it available for critique. Thank you so much, art, for doing that, which is part of, what we hope the arts give to these issues. I think many people, the neighbors that she's addressing, don't experience it that way. They're like, this is where we get some fruit. And it's not that they don't see that there's a redirected supply chain and that somebody's figured this out, but they wouldn't necessarily put the in quotation mark quality to it, and they experience it as a better service, as one that is more in line with their values and that is more there. So it is absolutely different. At the same time, and I gestured to this and gestured to it with other of these artists that I tend to work on and track, Lauren's art world practice, is very much part of the economy that keeps this going. The fact that she's like Theaster Gates and now like Rick Lowe, who's selling paintings, the fact that they sell their work as art is actually going back to fund the social apparatus. So that's also, whether we call that a representational art practice or not, it is definitely engaged in an art world practice. And that's also, I don't even want to call it sort of paradox, it's sort of the everythingness of it, that we're not going to pretend that that's not there. So I did want to foreground that. Yeah, Da Silva's film is representational. That it is at this site that is of those places that you receive in a certain way, and it's actually coming. The variation in all of the art projects is probably also a symptom of this other aspiration I have, which is, I said it really briefly. I have a hope, actually, if I do write a big project again, to imagine an ecologically engaged project across art forms, and actually to try to think, what is it that different art forms do through their media in terms of engaging climate environment, and to say that literary works, science fiction works, that and others might do something different than a film does, which I'm most interested myself in hybrid art practices that join media. But you're right to note that Da Silva, I'm interested in that because it's a video art piece. And I am really interested, I just happen to have a side interest on what video art does and how its capacity for mixing, for instance, how that medium, it's not only that it's representational, because what you didn't get to see is how it travels across different places in the globe, how it juxtaposes things that you cannot see simultaneously with the human eye. And video and film's capacity to do that mixing is one of the things that the medium does that I think is really important for environmental climate stuff. So that's a next part of an argument. It's not so much to me, I get that it's representational and it's not a community project. But I also am really interested in taking seriously the sensory thinking feeling thing about an environmental video art piece and what that does, and thinking specifically about how the mix editing quality of film and video that can juxtapose here and there, past and present, now and then, it and her, can create this kind of interdependent inseparability that also seems important. And I don't think that every art piece has to have the same values or the same type of functionality that others do. And so I am interested to put them together. Thanks for your question. It allows me to say more about why I'm interested in a lot of different things. Thank you.
We have time for one or two more questions. Yeah, Gordon.
Yeah, hi. I'm a geographer. I
Oh.
have lots of colleagues, sorry to intervene. Lots of colleagues who are also interested in art projects in a
oh, good.
sense, okay? But in a slightly different sense, because their idea of scale perhaps gets in their way. They're interested in the emissions along the Autobahn, and can I track them?
Yeah.
Can I scale the future so that I can come up with what will the planet look like in another 50 years?
So it's projective, it's,
Yes,
using
that's right.
those
And it's also remote sensing, so they're using images of destroyed and rehabilitated landscapes as art objects in exhibitions. So, all connected to climate change, of course. And perhaps the connection to your talk is to get you to talk about scale and its importance here.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily, they're not necessarily disconnected to environmental justice, but they're not directly connected to local environmental justice claims in the way that your artists are.
Yes, or unless they happen to be a geographer who is interested, but not all necessarily are. Well, I will say we're lucky enough at Berkeley to have a geography program too, and there's, as Shane knows, in almost every cohort, there's at least one art person, every graduate student cohort, and it's so fun to have them in our seminars, and sometimes we get many of them. So I'm always happy to be getting to engage with geographers, so thanks for coming here. I guess there's a couple things I would say. Even showing the work of forensic architecture is in many ways showing design systems, CAD programs, sensor technologies, hacked GPS systems, sometimes the tools of geography, sometimes the tools of architecture, of architectural modeling, are hacked and redistributed, and they produce things that if they were in, say, a science or technology museum, a science museum, might look like I'm just trying to explain how the world works, And I do then wonder, what is it that the art term does to these use of tools? And I think that your geographers don't have to be engaged in the arts. They can create visualizations, right, that don't have to be called art. But what does the art label do? It's akin to me asking, what's the poetic part? And I think one of the things is how I answered the other question. When the work shows its seams, how did the geographer get there? And how was the data manipulated so that it creates a kind of more of an invitation to be in a different kind of relationship with the receiver, rather than I am the scientist who has figured this out and I will transmit my knowledge to you. There's something a little bit more, participatory, and also the sense that things could go a lot of different directions. Also, I think that, frankly, a number of artistic projects could really benefit from the use of geographic tools that many of us, them, are fairly limited in terms of our skill set. So this is also part of when I say before that when I say that many who have these aspirations need infrastructural studies, I might as well say they need geographical studies. They need geographers to work in order to really think about how to represent and intervene in systems. But a last thing that you said just prompts me to say something that I now realize I didn't say around scale. And the hardest thing that most everybody says about climate change and the ecological is that it's too big for a human to apprehend in the moment that she is being destructive for the climate. We don't see in the moment what you're doing in this space does to another space, right? You don't see, what happens to your trash and how it ends up in landfill. We don't see how the factories in one country have an effect on the Amazon forest. So that cross-spatial connection isn't something that a human brain can hold. And similarly across time, that we don't see this decision that you're making now is going to have this effect later, and you don't feel accountability toward it or in it. So that notion of scale is the hardest thing about climate change, and that is what geographers are so good at helping us think about, at helping us represent. So I will say, even if they don't always want to do it for the ecological issues, I do think that geographers have these visualization techniques for helping hold that imagination. I foregrounded some idiosyncratic techniques for trying to imagine trans-temporal, trans-spatial connection. I think film does it too, as I said, but I really do think that that is a huge thing that geographers have to contribute to this issue, whether it's with artists or all of us. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we've actually come to the end of our allotted time, and I would hope that we can fulfill our promise to provide you, Shannon, and actually everybody gathered here with a small reception downstairs. And I hope that this will not be a broken promise. This is actually something that we pledge to fulfill. And I would like to thank you again for really expanding our horizons and our thought processes regarding infrastructure right up into the clouds. Thanks very, very much for coming here.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.